So what we try to do is, on the one hand, to have an on-the-spot weekly debate about this rapidly developing, changing crisis, and on the other hand, doing this book a bit as a stock-taking exercise. What is the debate? What are the different proposals from people who see that this crisis is, on the one hand, a crisis which produces a lot of hardship, but as it produces hardship, we at least should use this to reflect and to think what needs to change to create a more sustainable and a more fairer global economy.
Contextually, the book that's been distributed from the column gives, I think, a historical flowchart, as it were, of comments from a number of progressive trade union thinkers over the last 18 months as the crisis has really evolved. I think the common theme running through all that is a recognition this crisis has been global. It's been the scale of a world war. It's been extremely unfair in that the people who've borne the brunt of it have been working families. They didn't cause the crisis. It's been doctrinaire driven in that it's largely had its roots in a series of policies and ideology of just basically letting markets work without proper government constraints. I don't think at the moment we're looking at a situation which is a return to business as usual. We're looking at potentially a situation which is much worse than that, because the policies which governments are now announcing in terms of fiscal restraint, cutbacks, moving back to orthodoxy on the economic side, is at a time when the global economy is still extremely fragile, where unemployment has only just begun to slow down across most of the industrialized countries, and there are still major problems in the emerging economies. And we're still left with the crisis before the crisis of the very large increase in income inequality, which itself provoked. Now, if at this time governments shift their attention away from measures to support employment and go back simply to cutting budget deficits, I think the real risk of moving in to renewed recession, increase in unemployment again, as well as all of the implications of cutbacks in public expenditure, is very, very real. First of all, I think it has to be far fairer. We've seen on income distribution, first of all, a shift over the last 15 years from wages to profits by about 10 percentage points of GDP. Secondly, we've also seen coming out of 15 years of very rapidly rising inequality within the wage share. So again, the focus of how to redistribute has to be at the core of, I think, the new economic model in the future. So the question, I think, posed here for the ILO to some extent, now that in one way or another they are going to be part with the IMF of looking at the framework for the medium-term more balanced growth and the mutual assessment process, which was agreed by the G20, is how to make a mark on that process in the sort of more balanced flow between different regions. Thirdly, the model has to be far more orientated to strengthening development, going beyond the Millennium Development Goals. And I think one question here perhaps we need to discuss is that the countries that have come out better of this crisis have been the ones who didn't follow the Washington Consensus, but rather actually followed a more border-based policy towards their own development objectives. Fourthly, I think the model has to be far more balanced between financial markets and the real economy. We have to downsize financial markets, financial services again, bring in more unorthodoxy with regard to how pension fund money is used, what are the sort of financial institutions which actually meet the real economy needs, as well as a more regulated overall financial system. And lastly, clearly the model has to be far more balanced between achieving environmental goals, and in particular tackling climate change, as well as straight short-term economic or profit-driven objectives.
The first condition for the agenda to move forward is to act wisely on the fiscal front. And it's interesting that last year we saw a number of measures on the employment and social protection front consistent with the Global Jobs Pact, which proved to be effective in putting a floor on the crisis and indeed kickstarting the economy. And indeed, as you mentioned yourself, Frank, it would be a mistake to just move very quickly in all the countries to austerity measures, because the private sector, the business sector, has not acquired sufficient dynamism to grow autonomously. Credit to the enterprise sector is still constrained. Enterprises continue to report in developed countries difficulties to have access to credit. Consumption is stagnant, declining in some countries. In emerging economies, the situation very much and the recovery depends very much still, of course, on exports. So if there is double dip in developed countries, of course, it will affect very significantly emerging economies. So the first point, again, is act wisely on the fiscal front by avoiding the rapid contagion of austerity measures, and indeed put emphasis on what we know that worked last year, indeed before even, which is to put emphasis on measures with high employment multipliers. We know a lot about the nature of these measures.
We need to regulate financial markets to ensure that finance goes back to its legitimate role, that of a provider of funds for production, serving societies and not the reverse. This is why this book is an important contribution to the debate over policies that still needs to happen.
All of these ideas are just there. They're just on paper. They will need to be implemented. They will need to be appropriated and articulated in the political agenda. And that's where I believe in that. Maybe the unions have failed in the recent past. And that's where possibly some of the directions pointed in, I would particularly recommend Greg Albo's contribution for this, pointed in this book can be of use. Greg makes the point that unions should have much more confrontational strategies in the workplace, not allow themselves to be rolled back by employer pressures. That it's time actually to not be scared.
Moi, je rejoins le constat qui a été fait par rapport à le fait qu'on n'a pas tiré les leçons et qu'au contraire, on a un mouvement au contraire qui s'amorce. Et j'en témoignerai notamment ce qui se passe au niveau européen, où dans le programme qui est actuellement en discussion pour les 10 années à venir, on a un retour de flamme de la filière économique qui reprend, qui veut redicter en fait ses dictats économiques par rapport à la filière emploi. Et donc moi, ça c'est le discours qui se passe actuellement au niveau européen, on ne tire pas du tout les leçons, au contraire. Donc les discours ont changé depuis 2 ans. Et donc moi, ma question ici par rapport à aux pistes qui sont explorées, bon, depuis bien longtemps, on dit qu'il faudrait pouvoir au niveau international rééquilibrer les institutions et faire en sorte que l'OIT joue plus son rôle par rapport aux autres fondamentaux au niveau l'OMC, FMI. Bon, comment est-ce qu'on peut utiliser, et je crois qu'il y a des opportunités effectivement au travers de l'expérience qu'on vient de vivre, comment est-ce qu'on peut utiliser cette expérience-là pour réaffirmer sur le plan international la prééminence des normes sociales et la nécessité d'avoir des réponses adaptées où le social, en fait, est directement ancré sur l'économique.
En réponse à la crise de 2008, il y avait le pacte mondial pour l'emploi. Et je crois qu'ici, l'année précédente, tous les gouvernements du monde étaient là et ils se sont mis d'accord sur un pacte mondial qui reprenait les mêmes idées de votre livre. C'est les mêmes idées, les mêmes priorités, les 5 priorités, etc., etc. Mais qu'est-ce qu'on voit dans la réalité depuis une année? La réalité, c'est tout à fait la contradiction de ce qui a été dit ici. On voit sur la réalité plus de ressources étatiques, des ressources énormes pour sauver les institutions financières, et d'un autre côté, sur le côté social, plus d'austérité, plus de flexibilité. On constate dans nos pays maintenant que le travail temporaire devient la règle et non plus l'exception, plus de déréglementation et moins de solidarité sociale.